Welcome to A Little Bit Radical, a business podcast from Standing on Giants. I'm Rob, your host. Join me as I meet people and organisations who are doing things differently, challenging the status quo and, yes, might just be a little bit radical. What if you started a mobile company with no call centres, no stores, just an online community where customers would have a say on everything you did? This was the little bit radical idea behind giffgaff, now a hugely successful mobile brand in the UK. I'm joined today by Robbie Hearn, who was on the startup team at giffgaff and went on to co-found Standing on Giants, my employer. Today, Robbie and the Standing on Giants team help brands like Airbnb, Lenovo and Heineken build successful online communities for a range of purposes. Robbie, welcome to the podcast.
Welcome. Hello, Rob. It's good to be here. It's a very impressive intro.
Thank you very much. So we're going to start with you and a little bit radical you. So if you are a little bit radical, which you're on this podcast, so we know you are already, what do you think in your early life set you up for that?
When I think about, being radical and the things that I've done that could be seen that way, and when I think about other people who do things that could be seen as radical, I think a word that keeps coming up for me is change. That being radical pretty much always, I think, involves some kind of change. It's an active kind of thing. It's something that changes the status quo. So I think that's where my mind goes first when I think about my own early life, is that there was quite a bit of change in my early life, So without getting too personal, there was quite a lot of change. There was quite a bit of volatility. It wasn't the kind of super stable, super consistent type of upbringing of the ideal. So there was quite a lot of change, quite a lot of uncertainty, and just to give you one example, we moved house quite suddenly. When I was 12. So we lived in London, and my dad saw an advert on the TV where Roy Hudd, who was an old school actor, was playing a Roman, and he was, some kind of, marketing campaign. Come to Peterborough, it's amazing. And my dad, for some reason, just bought this hook, line, and sinker, and we ended up moving. The whole family moved, pretty quickly to Peterborough, where we didn't know anybody, we had no family connections. So it was a big change in my early life. It was one of many, but it's the one I've kind of, come back to as I'm thinking prior to the podcast, because it was quite a pivotal time in my life. That transition from being a child to a teenager, it was quite, unexplained. It was quite radical, really, right? It was quite a radical thing for my dad to have done and for the family to experience. And it didn't go well. I think that's the other thing. There was a problem with the house. It hadn't been built properly. We had to go out and live in a hotel for several months. Then the recession came in the late 80s. We ended up losing the house. So it was a radical change that didn't work out very well. And it had a big impact. But I think probably the inherent learning in there for me was, life is uncertain. Change does happen, and it might not always work out the way you think, but nobody dies, certainly in that experience. We got on with it, we adapted, we changed, made new friends. So I think having experience of quite radical change early in life is probably something that helps you be more radical later on in life. That's certainly one clear thought that I've had about it, prompted by your question.
Thank you. What I wonder is, do you think as you then grow up, so the word resilience is thrown around a lot at the moment.
Yeah.
So do you think that early experience set you up to be more resilient when you come to those big changes? And then do you feel that gave you more confidence to try things, take risks?
I think that there's probably some other factors at play there. So I think, yes, in that type of environment, you do typically become more resilient. Not necessarily because of confidence, though. I think it's more because you don't have a choice. It's either adapt or don't, right? And you haven't really got the choice of not adapting when you're a child and when these things are happening. So I think certainly resilience is an outcome, and that is very helpful as you grow older. The other factor at play for me certainly was freedom, a certain type of freedom of action and freedom of thought, which again was the kind of silver lining of a not so good thing, which was more like a lack of support, a lack of belonging, interestingly, a lack of community. So we were quite an isolated family, I think, and so, the cons of that were we didn't have the support network around us, there wasn't like a pre-planned route for the kids, if you know what I mean. It was very different to, for instance, growing up in a family of doctors, where you would feel the expectation that you need to become a doctor or an engineer or go into the family business or whatever that history is there. I think in my family, we didn't have that. So there was a downside, which was you were kind of left to your own devices. There was a little bit more anxiety around. But on the plus side, there was also a lot of freedom in the sense of there's no real expectations here, right? And there's no real pressure either, right? So I think a combination of those two things is what leads to resilience, independent thinking, and a certain tolerance of risk. I think was the other thing I was noting to myself, is that when your environment is structured that way, as opposed to a very, very safe, supported, pre-planned kind of environment, I think to some extent in that environment it's probably harder to act independently, to take a different path, because there's so much pre-existing conditioning really about the things you should do. And that wasn't true for me, So to some extent I was free to, determine my own destiny. Sounds a bit grand, but make my own choices, take my own path. I think that my environment allowed me to do that, and I think over time that built resilience, and over time it built confidence. But I think those words in particular are, super important words, but I think those qualities, they really take time to develop. I don't think they just instantly appear.
Absolutely. So taking that thread as you've developed those skills into your adult life, do you think you've become more or less radical as you've grown older? Not very old, by the way. Throughout your adult life, and what do you think's been behind that?
I think the honest answer to that is it has to be a nuanced answer. It's probably not a black or white thing. I think probably the quality of radicalness maybe comes and goes throughout someone's life, and maybe it's easier. One thing I noticed about myself actually is I think I found it easier to be radical at work versus radical in my personal life. So I think there's probably some nuance around the question there. But without copping out of it entirely, the other thing I thought is I genuinely would love to have the aspiration to become more radical as I grow older. I think that there's something about that I find very exciting. I think it's full of potential. I quite like the idea of kicking against the general perception is that we become, safer, more cautious, and less radical as we age. I think something in me really wants to kick against that. And I was thinking about people I admire, or I've thought about who fit that mold, and a couple of Willie Nelson, for instance, came to mind. I loved what I learned about him was that he was a very kind of early pictures of him. He's super conventional. He's got a suit and tie and a short haircut, and at some point he just thought, "This is not me," and he adopted a completely different look. He grew a big beard. He looked more like a hippie. His music took off. It became much more expressive, and that trajectory, I think, has a lot going for it. The other person I learned about recently is the comedian George Carlin, who, again, different sphere, but his early stage persona is so different to later ones. And unlike Willie Nelson, he went through 3 or 4 iterations of his stage performance, of his stand-up comedy. He became much more political as he got older. more fearless in what he would say on stage, up until he died, in his late 70s or his early 80s. So I think I can see in my own life I've probably become less radical after I had kids, for instance, and taken a few safer choices. But at the same time, I think some of the most radical things I've done have come later in my life, standing on Giants out of its parent company, via an MBO, going completely independent as an entrepreneur at the age of 45. Those are not necessarily safer choices and came after I had kids. So I think it's a mixed picture, but I'd love to be like George Carlin when I'm 80, rather than the alternative where I kind of shrink into a beige shell,
Yeah, no, beige shell. Well, I'm looking forward to seeing your hair length and your beard growth over the next few years, probably, and you saying more and more controversial things in public. That'd be great. We're going to come on to staying on Giants, of course, and you mentioned there about taking that company independent, which is a huge leap of faith. I'm going to ask you about that later, but first, when we come into your work and the radical things that you've been involved with, I think our listeners would really love to hear about the start of giffgaff and that just very simple radical idea of taking out. We're going to start a mobile company, but it's not going to have a call center. It's not going to have any stores. It's not going to have any of the traditional operational tools of a mobile company. Take us back to that time and what was happening and how it all went.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the idea of giffgaff was very radical at the time. And the idea originally came from a man called Gav Thompson, who was employed by Telefonica to come up with ideas, basically. And he had been inspired by a trip to San Francisco in 2008 when he'd been exposed to the Obama's election campaign. And I think it lit a fire in him. He was so inspired by what he saw there, because what Obama did in 2008, which was very radical, different to previous campaigns, was he really engaged the grassroots. So he went out. He's famous for doing it on social media, but he actually really did it offline as well. He really went out into communities, and with his kind of really strong messaging and his authenticity, he built an incredibly powerful grassroots movement of younger people who particularly believed in his mission. And those people went out and campaigned for him and built the movement that kind of swept him to office. So his whole approach to an electoral campaign was very different. And it really, the word I would use to it that I connect with my working kind of ethos and what I care about in the working world is respect. I think he really respected his base, and he thought these people, deserve my respect, and they can actually do more for me than just simply watch a TV ad and send in $10. They can actually do things. And I think that was the core of the idea of giffgaff, was that at that point, mobile companies really didn't respect their customers very much. They were used to raking in billions and billions and billions of profit without really taking care of customers, without really always doing the right thing for customers. So there were some quite, shonky marketing practices around in the industry at that time, and contracts where you would still be paying for the phone even though you'd paid off the cost of the phone unless you cancelled it, and all that kind of thing. So the public were very fed up with mobile companies and didn't have a choice. And the idea of giffgaff was, well, we're going to be very, very different. We are going to be straightforward. We're going to be honest. We're going to be transparent, and we're going to have this word mutual was a key part of it. So because we're not going to have all that infrastructure that you mentioned, the shops and the call centers, we're actually going to ask you, the customer, to help out with the business, whether that's helping us with marketing or customer service or giving us ideas for products. You're going to be part of it with us. You're going to come on this journey with us. It's going to be a partnership. And it would be easy to be very cynical about that type of proposition or messaging. But I think the great thing about giffgaff is that they actually, delivered on that. It wasn't just a piece of marketing. We actually built the company from the ground up so that the customers could participate through the vehicle, as you know, of an online community initially. But the great thing was the company was genuinely committed to that vision and that set of values, which were all about transparency, honesty, and respect. So that's what really drew me, to the company, because I think that they were the things that I really cared about and still care about. I think if I boiled it down to one thing in my working life, it would be, let's treat customers with respect. And it still fires me up. It still makes me angry when companies don't do that, because it's still everywhere. I mean, just this morning I was looking at Barclays' quarterly profits, 3.5 billion, an insane amount of money. Every time I go on Barclays' website to try and contact customer service, I see the same message. Oh, we're so sorry, very busy. We're, nobody can talk to you. It's just wrong. It's just nonsense, right? You're making billions and billions and billions, but you're not investing in the customer. You don't respect the customer. And I think that passion to treat customers properly and respect the customer is the kind of driving force in my professional life. And coming back to your original question, that's what I saw in the vision for giffgaff, and that's why I joined them. And I would have left if they hadn't have delivered on that, but they did. They set a great new example in the world of telco about how to do things differently, and the radical change worked.
Absolutely. I had no idea that the original inspiration was from the Obama campaign. That's fantastic. Yeah. So thank you for sharing that. I love what you said about customer respect as well. I think over the there's a lot of customer buzzwords that have been knocking around for years and years and years. We've had obviously customer experience, then customer obsession, which seems to be a slightly creepy and slightly strange way to treat your customers as well. Not particularly healthy. Maybe it's time for the era of customer respect. I think that would go a long way for a lot of businesses.
I think it would. I think it actually has something concrete, at the heart of it, which is missing from a lot of those phrases that you've legitimately called out. I mean, I think the one there that I would, give as another example is Amazon and their focus on customer experience. For instance, so they're lauded all the time for talking about, their great customer experience. And I think while that is true, there's also, a slightly darker side to that, because the experience is optimized so that there can be more and more and more transactions. Ultimately, I think the underlying driver of improving Amazon's customer experience is not necessarily rooted in customer respect, because it is ultimately rooted in how does Amazon make more money, So I think they're two, different concepts. So I think you're right. Whereas I think it's harder to, if you really as a company focused on customer respect, it would be harder to get away with some of those things. There'd be less wriggle room.
Absolutely. So you thought the giffgaff really nailed this customer respect thing and getting them involved. What's your favourite example from a customer or group of customers at giffgaff helping the business grow and flourish?
Yeah, it would definitely be the thing that became known as the micro sim. I don't know what the micro sim miracle, I'd probably call it, without being a religious person. But in a nutshell, what happened was one of the early iPhone releases, I think it was the iPhone 4, used a cut down SIM for the first time. And it was a big problem for us because about 40% of our customers had iPhones, or 40% of our new customers had iPhones, maybe even higher in those days. So it was a big, big part of our business. And all the SIMs that we had in the warehouse were the wrong size. We didn't have the money to re-engineer the stock or to replace it or anything. So there was a real problem for the company at that point, and it was solved not within hours, but very, very quickly by the customers of the business. It was not solved by the business, because what happened was within hours, people on the community were sharing their own designs for something called a SIM cutter, which we weren't aware of at the time. It looked a bit like a stapler. You put a SIM in it, and if you punched it just right, it would cut off the superfluous bit of the SIM and leave the SIM able to work in the new phone. So it was kind of a maker type, hacker type thing. And literally within hours of the announcement, there were people on the community saying, I've got one of these things, I can cut a SIM for you. And then that exploded into people drawing little diagrams of how you could put a SIM on a piece of paper and cut it out yourself. And then it went further and further and further. But I think the great thing about giffgaff was that when we noticed that, we didn't shut it down, which is what would happen in a traditional telco. We said, oh no, we can't have customers doing that, health and safety, danger to the brand, da 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 da. Instead, we contacted the people in the community who were doing it, we talked to them more about it, and we ended up empowering one of the community members who was a teenager actually with coding skills. He built a website where anybody who wanted one of these SIMs could register, and anybody with a SIM cutter would cut a SIM for them. So it was essentially, there was more to it in the background, which we don't have time to go into. But essentially what happened was, inspired by the community and using people in the community to perform all the roles, we built a kind of secondary supply chain, a distribution network that would supply anyone who wanted a micro SIM with a micro SIM. And it ended up being running in parallel on the giffgaff main website, and we served something like 150,000 customers that way, which is a lot of customers for us at the time, over a few months, until the company was able to actually afford to buy, its own micro SIMs. So, that was the kind of thing which was genuinely amazing to witness, and the kind of creative solution to a problem which you couldn't possibly ever anticipate. That if you've done the radical thing in the first place of rethinking who your customers are and respecting them and believing that they can help you, then this is the kind of creative solution that becomes possible. Whereas if you don't make that radical jump in the first place, you shut down the opportunity for all those marvelous things to happen.
What an incredible story! That's blown my mind. That's blown my mind. I don't think I've heard that story before, but not the full extent of it. So that was what a pleasure. 150,000 customers able to stay with giffgaff or join giffgaff thanks to the community. Absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, and they're receiving a SIM that's been cut and packaged and sent to them by another customer, even with welcome letters.
Yeah.
The customers are writing their own welcome letters and to go inside the envelopes and all the rest of it. So it was a really quite a mind-blowing thing to witness at the time, really.
That's fantastic. We should move on to your own business now. So you founded Standing on Giants a few years after giffgaff had started to be successful. I gather that this was due to you kind of falling in love with the idea of communities more so than the telco industry, perhaps. You let me know whether that's fair. But what kind of maybe when you first started the business and then the management buyout kind of phase, that's quite a leap of faith. What was it, do you think, that made you take that leap?
I think it was a combination of factors where I was just excited by the opportunity that was out there in the world to have more companies and organizations embrace the community model that giffgaff had started. That was a very real thing in my mind. I could see the potential of that. And I think, by the way, that ability to have an idea and to visualize it is probably part of being radical, whatever that means. Because without an idea, without some kind of, something to go after, there is no radical action, really. So I think part of it was I really could see the potential that was out there, and I could see that it would be very difficult to reach that potential by, essentially running a small business that was part of a multinational corporation that had many other focuses, So I think that would be the kind of practical answer to the question. And I think the more personal answer to the question is I was becoming more self-confident, I suppose, at that time in my life, and more, I think the word autonomy was becoming more and more important to me, and I think I could see that the only way really to get the autonomy I wanted, to execute the vision that I could see, would be to do something radical, like try and buy the company off the corporate parent. So when the hint of that opportunity started to come up because of the political reorganization of Telefonica, I think I took the leap of faith. I did have to push myself to do it because I was recently married with a young child at the time, and it definitely didn't it definitely was not the safe option. The safe option would have been to stay with giffgaff, which was growing wildly at that point. But something in me couldn't be put out, I suppose. A voice in me just couldn't be silenced. Really, the excitement of what could be was greater than the fear of staying where I was.
That's really interesting. So you just couldn't not do it, almost. And I think that's going to be a common. I believe that will be a common theme with the guests of this podcast. Actually, just couldn't not do it.
I think that's a very good way of articulating how it felt at the time. It was scary, but I just felt there's just I will regret this forever if I don't take a chance, if I don't go for it. Yeah, I couldn't not do it. That's a very good way of putting it. Yeah.
So you've founded your business, run the business now for a number of years. What would you say you're most proud of professionally?
I think it's two things. One is the type of business that Standing on Giants has become. I think I'm very proud of that because, as you know, it was your idea originally that we become a B Corp. But I think that I'm very proud of that because it's a physical manifestation of something that was important to me about the type of business that we created. That when Vincent and I founded the business, it was very important to both of us that we founded a different type of business. Not one that was primarily focused or on optimizing profits at all costs. It was very important. So I've talked previously about the kind of, the practical opportunity that the business was there to realize. But this other side of the coin is, okay, as we execute that vision, what type of business, how, what's important to us as a business in the way we operate. And I think for Vincent and I, it was very important that we didn't go down the route, which was very common at the time and still is obviously, of being backed by VC money and planning an exit in a certain number of years. And that route is all about the money, basically, So we really wanted to do something different, and we did. We fought hard to make the business independent without taking external finance, and we still haven't done that. And as you know, over the years, as we've evolved the business, we've tried to do more and more and more to make the business a living example of a different type of business, one that really does care about returning value to a wider group of stakeholders, and not just the shareholders. It's not just about profit; it's about planet and people as well. So I'm very proud that the business, thanks to you and the other people who've come in as well, it's by far not just something that me and Vincent have done, is we've assembled a group of people, I think, who believe the same type of things and are taking the business forward, and that's a kind of a never-ending journey. And just like the giffgaff story, you don't know exactly what's going to happen. That's not the important thing. The important thing is the underlying principles, the values that drive the business, and trying to make those more real and have a bigger impact. And I think that the business is really on that track. It's growing and it's developing and it's doing new things all the time. So I'm very, very proud of that. Of the business that we've created.
Thank you for the shout out personally as well. But anyone listening who's not familiar with the B Corp movement and B Corp certification, it's a group of businesses that sign up to the kind of highest standards of environmental and social responsibility, and we're a proud member of, I think, a nearly 1,000 strong community in the UK now of B Corps. So as we come towards the end of our time together today, I'd like to turn our focus outwards again to the world. Dare we go there? And what's a change or an idea that's a little bit radical that you would really like to see in the world?
Yes, well, I think for this one, I'm gonna push the envelope of a little bit radical. I think because I genuinely think the biggest change that would benefit the world at the moment is a completely new political system. Not just in this country, but in every country, pretty much. I'm just so depressed when I look at the appalling, inadequate state of our political system, and the kind of people that we have in power. that are managing, trillions of pounds supposedly for the benefit of the country. And I just don't believe it anymore. I think it's very hard to have faith in the system. I think the system is letting the country down, really. So I don't know, it's a question that's way too big, obviously, for me or any individual person, what that change is, but I think if I could pick one thing that would really make a difference, it would be that, right? Because the political system is at the heart of everything else, really. It's the heart of our health and our education. It's the heart of our business. It's our economy. And it really made me think of a quote that I loved by E.O. Wilson. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but if anyone isn't, I definitely recommend looking him up. He was a super respected scientist. I don't think he won the Nobel Prize. I think he won everything else you could possibly think of. And he devoted his life to the study of social animals. So ants and bees, and things. He's one of the world experts on that. And he extrapolated what he learned into the human sphere. He's a great communicator, a great thinker, and he wrote some very influential things. But the quote that sticks with me when I think about the change that we need, the quote runs something like, humanity's greatest problem is that we have godlike technology, but primeval emotions and medieval institutions. And I think, God, he hit the nail on the head there,
I love that.
Yeah. And, let's change it. We can't necessarily change our biology. We can't, certainly there's things we can do to become more aware of our emotions, to manage them for ourselves. I think all of us would benefit from doing that, I think. But we, and we have the godlike technology, that is just going to keep getting more and more godlike. I think the bit that we can change, if we can possibly find common cause, and if we can find the right ideas, and if we can motivate people, is the medieval institutions. And if you want an example of a medieval institution, you only have to look at Prime Minister's Question Time, on a Wednesday. I mean, it's just not fit for purpose to channel Tony Blair. We should be able to do better.
How would you change Prime Minister's questions, do you think?
The first thing I would do is make the questions from the people, not just this tiny band of self-centered, agenda-driven, incompetent politicians.
Yeah, so a more community-led approach to that ultimately. Yeah.
More direct politics, I think, is the way I would put it. That would feed, it would feed through the whole political system. But the reason that we've got political parties and a small group of MPs is rooted in, as E.O. Wilson says, medieval institutions, right? When we didn't have the technology, when we had a much more hierarchical social system, and it was, it was physically impossible to have a peasant ask the Prime Minister a question, right? Now it's not impossible, right? Now we have technology, we have the internet, we have a much flatter social system. Why aren't there 3 questions from Joe Public live on TV every Wednesday, right? As well as whatever Keir Starmer or Angela Rayner's got to say, Yes, we can hear from them. But wouldn't it be, wasn't it worth trying having you asking Rishi Sunak a question, or, a plumber from Wales, or, a doctor from Inverness, or, deliberately pick people from across society and get them directly involved in the political process would just be, one thing I can think of.
I don't hold out much hope for that one, Robbie, but that leads me to the final question. The final question is, if there's people listening to this who've got an idea that they think is a little bit radical, perhaps for their work or for their life, but sometimes we stop ourselves from taking it that next step. Do you have any advice for someone on how to go about starting to implement or do something with their idea that's a little bit radical?
I know something that helped me at that particular time when I had to make the decision about, do I stay with giffgaff? Do I take this leap into the unknown? All this uncertainty with setting up Standing on Giants as an independent company. I came across a talk from someone, I can't remember, she was the female founder of a chain of coffee shops, I think in Canada or somewhere. And the central message from her was, leap and the net will appear, which really resonated with me at the time and still resonates with me. leap and the net will appear. You've just got to take the leap. If you take the leap, the support you need will happen, basically, And I think her story was that, she knew nothing at all about coffee, but she had an idea that actually coffee shops could be a bit different. And there was all these voices in her head and in her friendship group saying, you can't do that. You know nothing about coffee, right? But someone gave her this phrase, leap and the net will appear. And so she did take the leap and the net did appear, and that has been my experience. And I know from, one of the great things about taking the route through life that I've had is that I've met a lot of other founders and entrepreneurs and people who've done radical things and taken that leap. And I would say, that is true of all of them, right? They all had that moment or continuing, I should say that actually, it's continuing self-doubt, not like it just evaporates and you find all the answers. I think the answer is not to try and dismiss the fear, but it's to embrace the fear and live with it and just leap and the net will appear. If you can find some way of believing that, then I think you can do anything.
Feels very related to Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway, which is a very popular book, isn't it? I think, which gets sometimes I think it's sometimes quite cruelly lumped with a lot of other self-help kind of books, which are a bit more snake oil like. But I think Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway is a great mantra for getting slightly more radical things through.
Yes, you have nothing to fear but fear itself. All of those things, they're all kind of can seem a bit hackneyed and cliched, but I think there's a really strong element of truth in them, and I think it's very unlikely that you'll regret giving it a go, and there's a multitude of paths out there, so if it doesn't work, it's not a disaster either, like something else will appear, right? Some other opportunity will manifest itself. But I think if you've got any kind of inkling to do something, you should do it. I don't think there's a lot to lose, really, even if it doesn't work out the way you think it's going to work out. The house in Peterborough wasn't the way we thought. We lost it in the end. Giffgaff had its own time, and it was time to do something else. And I think that experience is replicated, probably 1 million times a day all around the world. And the alternative is getting stuck and wishing you'd done it when you no longer have the physical capability. There's a great film full of quotes today, and I'll probably mangle the Dalai Lama, but there's a great one from him like that about how people just don't appreciate the opportunities they've got until it's too late.
I think that's a fantastic note to end on. That's optimistic and call to arms for anyone out there with their radical idea. So Robbie, thank you very much for joining us on the Little Bit Radical podcast. You didn't have a choice as you're my boss, but I really appreciate it anyway, and I think everything you said was really, really fascinating, and I'm sure people will enjoy listening to it. Thank you for listening to this podcast. If you enjoyed it, please follow us on your podcast platform. If you'd like to appear on A Little Bit Radical or have an idea of someone we should speak to, please email podcast@standingongiants.com or get in touch with me on LinkedIn. You can search Rob Fawkes or search Standing on Giants and you'll find me there. Thank you very much and speak to you next time.